He thought he controlled everything, his empire, his wife, his future. But one night changed it all, and by morning, the woman he underestimated had already won. The night was supposed to disappear by morning. Josue Smith believed that as firmly as he believed in quarterly forecasts, in market dominance, in the quiet obedience of systems he had learned to control. Nights like this spent behind tinted windows and velvet curtains were not meant to follow a man home. They were sealed compartments in a life built on precision. The Bentley glided through Manhattan's near-empty streets as dawn bled softly into the sky. Pale light reflected off glass towers and steel facades, turning the city into something fragile, almost honest. Josue barely noticed. His jacket lay folded beside him, his tie loosened, his shirt creased in ways that had nothing to do with work. The scent lingered. Rita's perfume, warm, expensive, unmistakable, clung to his collar. He caught it as he shifted in his seat, registering it the way one might register background noise. Not unpleasant, not urgent, just there. He didn't roll down the window. Rita had laughed when he left, trailing her fingers along his wrist as if she were entitled to linger there. She always laughed that way, soft, confident, like someone who believed she understood the rules of the game. Maybe she did. Maybe that was why nights with her felt uncomplicated. No expectations, no weight, no reminders of who he was supposed to be. The Bentley eased into the private garage beneath his Upper East Side penthouse. The gates closed behind him with a muted hum. Josue stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks, already compartmentalizing the hours he intended to forget. His phone vibrated in his palm. He glanced at the screen just long enough to see the number. 18 missed calls, 31 unread messages. He locked the phone without opening a single one. Lillian, his pregnant wife of 5 years, 5 months along, 5 months into a season of heightened emotions, doctor visits, lists pinned to refrigerators, things that felt oddly distant from the world he occupied most days. She worries too much, he muttered, checking his reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors. His face looked the same, controlled, composed, untouchable, the kind of face that investors trusted and journalists admired. The elevator rose smoothly, floor numbers blinking past in calm succession. Josue leaned back against the mirrored wall, replaying the night in fragments he'd later pretend not to remember. The wine, the view from the hotel windows. Rita's voice, low and assured, telling him he deserved to be wanted. Another vibration. He ignored it. If this story already feels like it's heading somewhere dangerous, pause for a moment, like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. It helps this channel bring you more stories that go where others won't. The elevator slowed. For a brief second, so brief he almost dismissed it, something tightened in his chest. A flicker of unease. Not guilt. Not fear. Just a sense that the air had shifted. The doors slid open. Silence greeted him. Not the brittle silence of an argument paused mid-breath. Not the tense quiet of a house waiting for confrontation. This silence was hollow, unoccupied. It stretched across the wide marble floors and climbed the walls, settling into corners that had once been alive with movement. "Lillian," he called, irritation creeping into his voice. No answer. Josue stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. The penthouse lights were dimmed, as they always were at night, but something felt off. The space felt larger, emptier, as though the room had exhaled and forgotten how to inhale again. He took another step. That was when he saw it. On the glass dining table, centered carefully, deliberately rested a diamond ring. Lillian's ring. The one he'd commissioned years ago, insisting on a cut rare enough to make headlines. It caught the early morning light and scattered it in sharp, unforgiving angles. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper. Josue stopped moving. Time slowed, stretching thin until the silence pressed against his ears. His pulse thudded, suddenly loud, suddenly insistent. He approached the table with measured steps, as if the objects might vanish if he moved too quickly. The paper was heavier than he expected when he picked it up. Neat handwriting. Controlled, no smudges. He unfolded it. "I hope she was worth what you're about to lose." 7 words. No explanation. No accusations. No anger. Just certainty. Something unfamiliar surged up his throat, tight, sharp, unwelcome. He swallowed hard, his gaze snapping back to the table, to the ring that no longer circled Lillian's finger. "Lillian," he said again, softer this time. Still nothing. His eyes began to move, scanning the room with new urgency. Details surfaced all at once, rushing forward as if they'd been waiting to be noticed. The designer handbags that once lined the console by the door were gone. The framed photograph from their anniversary trip missing. The kitchen lights were on. The refrigerator door sat slightly ajar. He crossed the space quickly, pulling it open. Empty shelves where prenatal vitamins had been stacked with careful precision. No neatly labeled containers. No reminder notes. He turned, his breath coming faster now. And his gaze landed on the hallway mirror. The ultrasound photo that had been taped there carefully aligned, always in his line of sight, was gone. The tape remained, curled and empty. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a fight. This was an exit. Josue moved down the hallway, his steps echoing louder than they should have. The bedroom door stood open. Inside, the room looked stripped, as if someone had methodically removed warmth itself. The closet doors yawned wide, revealing rows of empty hangers. Lillian's dresses, chosen thoughtfully, season by season, were gone. The dresser drawer, where she kept her pregnancy journals, sat half open, empty. The scent of her lotion lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of presence that made the absence ache more sharply. Josue stood there, unmoving, as the realization settled into his bones. She hadn't left impulsively. She had planned this. Near the window, something caught his eye. The picture frame on the dresser once holding the sonogram stood empty. Clean. Intentional. Their child, his legacy. For the first time in his adult life, Josue Smith felt something he couldn't name immediately. Powerlessness. It crept up his spine, cold and unwelcome, eroding the certainty he had built his life upon. If Lillian had walked away this thoroughly, then she knew. Not suspected. Knew. And if she knew, she hadn't been alone. Someone had helped her. Someone with access, with resources, with patience. A name surfaced uninvited, settling heavily in his thoughts. Lucas Green, the only rival who had ever looked Josue in the eye without blinking. The only man who'd spoken to Lillian at events as if she were more than an accessory. Josue clenched his jaw, folding the note carefully and slipping it into his pocket. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This was strategy. And as the morning light crept further into the penthouse, illuminating every empty space Lillian had left behind, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever had just begun didn't start tonight. It started long before Josue Smith ever believed he could afford to look away. Before we go any further, make sure you've liked this video, subscribed, turned on notifications, and dropped a comment with the city you're watching from. Because what led Lillian to leave didn't happen overnight, and the truth behind her silence changes everything. The silence didn't fade. It settled. Josue stood in the center of the bedroom long after the first shock had passed, his gaze moving slowly, methodically, as if his eyes might catch something his mind was refusing to accept. The morning light crept farther across the floor, outlining the absence with cruel clarity. Every place Lillian had once occupied now felt too clean, too deliberate, like a room prepared for inspection. He left the bedroom and walked back into the hallway. His footsteps measured, controlled. This was his house, his space. He had designed it to reflect order, success, permanence, and yet it felt like a stranger's home, familiar in structure, alien in spirit. Josue moved through the penthouse the way one might move through a crime scene, careful not to disturb anything, though there was nothing left to disturb. The living room came first. The built-in shelves that once held Lillian's carefully curated books were sparse now. Not empty, she hadn't been careless, but selectively stripped. The books she'd loved most were gone. The poetry collections she used to read aloud late at night when she thought he wasn't listening. The art catalogs from exhibitions she once spoke about with quiet excitement before he told her she no longer needed to work. The decorative objects remained. Expensive, untouched. It wasn't chaos. It was choice. Josue crossed to the console by the window, where a small bowl had once held her keys. The bowl was still there, Empty. Clean. Almost mocking in its simplicity. He lifted it, turning it over in his hand as if expecting something to fall out. Nothing did. He set it down carefully, irritation flaring beneath his ribs. She hadn't stormed out. There were no overturned chairs, no slammed doors, no half-packed bags abandoned in frustration. Everything about this screamed restraint. Intent. He moved into the kitchen again, opening cabinets he knew would be bare, pulling drawers that slid open smoothly, revealing nothing out of place because she'd already decided what belonged to her and what did not. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Indifferent. He stared at the empty shelf where her neatly organized vitamins had always been, labeled by day. "You planned this," he muttered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. The sound of his own voice startled him. It echoed. That was when he noticed how quiet the penthouse truly was. No ambient music drifting softly from hidden speakers, no faint sounds of movement, not even the hum of her laptop, always left open somewhere, running late into the night. The silence mirrored something he recognized too well. The silence Lillian had been offering him for months. He'd mistaken it for acceptance, for patience, for understanding. Standing there now, he realized it had been withdrawal. Piece by piece. Josue turned and headed back toward the bedroom, a new urgency tightening his movements. He went straight to the dresser, opening each drawer more forcefully than necessary. Empty. 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 The drawer where Lillian kept her pregnancy journals was open just enough to be noticeable. He pulled it the rest of the way out. Nothing. His fingers lingered on the edge of the wood, knuckles whitening. Those journals had been her constant. She wrote in them every night, sometimes for hours, documenting appointments, thoughts, fears, hopes she'd never spoken aloud. He had seen them often, stacked neatly, each one dated, gone. She hadn't left behind a single page. Josue sank onto the edge of the bed without realizing he'd done it. The mattress dipped beneath his weight, leaving a hollow space beside him where Lillian had slept. For years, he'd noticed that space only in passing, rolling over late at night. Already half gone. Now it felt cavernous. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. His breathing had grown shallow, uneven. The certainty he'd carried into the penthouse, the certainty that this was some misunderstanding, some dramatic pause waiting to be resolved, was unraveling thread by thread. She wasn't waiting for him to call. She wasn't waiting to be persuaded. Lillian had already left the conversation. Josue stood abruptly and crossed to the walk-in closet. The lights flickered on automatically, illuminating rows of empty hangers aligned with obsessive precision. Even the spacing was intentional. Lillian had always been meticulous about order, about balance. She had taken only what mattered. The shoes she favored were gone, the ones she wore every day, the sensible ones, the comfortable ones. A few of the luxury pairs remained unused, decorative, unnecessary. He opened the jewelry drawer. Her everyday pieces were missing. The delicate bracelet she wore constantly. The watch she favored over the one he'd gifted her. Only the extravagant items remained, untouched, as if she were making a statement he was only just beginning to understand. She hadn't wanted reminders of him. Josue backed out of the closet slowly, his heart pounding harder now. Fear, real fear, was beginning to surface, coiling tightly beneath his chest. Not the fear of loss he'd experienced in business deals gone wrong, but something deeper, more personal, irreversible. He turned toward the window again, his gaze landing on the dresser. The empty picture frame still sat there, catching the light. The absence inside it seemed louder than any accusation. Their child. He had always thought of the baby as a future marker, a continuation, something that would fit neatly into the life he had already constructed. Lillian had thought of it differently. He could see that now. Josue closed his eyes, memories surfacing uninvited. Lillian standing in the doorway weeks earlier, holding her phone out to him, her expression tentative. The ultrasound video playing silently on the screen. The flicker of movement, the heartbeat he barely looked at. He had been distracted, impatient. Later, he'd said, "I've got a call." She hadn't argued. She never argued anymore. His stomach twisted as the realization landed fully. The silence hadn't been peace. It had been preparation. Josue straightened, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced through possibilities, misunderstandings, manipulations, outside interference. It was easier to imagine enemies than to face the truth pressing down on him. She wouldn't just leave. He said aloud, as if the walls might argue back. Not like this, but the evidence was everywhere. Every missing object told the same story. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was strategy. He moved back into the living room, scanning for anything he might have missed. His gaze landed on the bookshelf again, and this time he noticed what remained. The volumes he'd insisted on keeping for appearances. The ones chosen for display rather than meaning. She'd taken her life with her. What she'd left behind was his. Josue felt something inside him fracture, subtle but unmistakable. A thin crack spreading through the foundation of the certainty he'd relied on for years. He had built his world on control, on predictability, on the belief that people moved when he told them to. Lillian had moved without asking, without warning, without leaving room for negotiation. He stopped pacing, standing very still as a chilling realization settled over him. She hadn't left to be chased. She hadn't left to make a point. She had left because she was done. The thought hollowed him out. Fear surged fully now. Unmasked and undeniable. Not fear of scandal. Not fear of loss of image. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that the woman he'd assumed would always be there had finally decided she didn't need him at all. Josue pressed his palm flat against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the city waking below. Cars moved. People hurried. Life continued. Indifferent to the collapse unfolding inside his penthouse. For the first time since he could remember, Josue Smith did not know what move to make next. He had spent his life believing silence meant compliance. Now he understood the truth far too late. Silence meant departure. And as the morning light fully claimed the room Lillian had emptied with such careful intention, Josue stood alone in the house without her. Realizing that whatever came next would not be resolved with an apology, a promise, or a well-timed phone call. The game had changed, and he was no longer the one setting the rules. There had been a time when Lillian believed love was something you built carefully, brick by brick, the way Josue built companies. She remembered those early days with startling clarity now, not because they were perfect, but because they had been full of promise. Possibility, the kind that makes you forgive small things because you're certain the bigger picture will make sense eventually. Back then, Josue had looked at her like she mattered. Their first apartment had been modest, compared to the penthouse that would come later. The windows were smaller, the furniture mismatched, but the space had been warm, alive. Josue used to come home earlier then, tossing his jacket aside, asking about her day with a distracted smile that still felt genuine. "You're brilliant," he'd told her once, watching her pace the living room as she talked through an idea for a gallery exhibition. "You see things differently." She had glowed under those words. Lillian had been proud of her career. Not because it made headlines, but because it made sense to her. Art had always been her language, the way she processed the world, the way she made meaning out of chaos. When Josue proposed, she had believed marriage would be an addition to her life, not a replacement. At first it was, then came the subtle shifts. The comments that felt harmless on the surface. "You don't need to work so hard anymore. Let someone else handle that. My schedule is crazy right now, we'll talk later." Later became a habit. When Josue's company grew, so did the demands on his time. Board meetings stretched into late nights. Business trips became more frequent. Lillian adjusted, telling herself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, they would find their rhythm again. She learned quickly that stability was a moving target. At social events, she noticed how Josue spoke for her without realizing he was doing it. How he redirected conversations away from her interests, steering them back toward himself. When she corrected him once, gently, he smiled tightly and said, "We'll talk about that at home." They never did. The gallery offers slowed, then stopped entirely. Not because Lillian wasn't capable, but because she stopped pursuing them. Each rejection, each dismissive glance from Josue when she mentioned work, taught her something new about survival. It was easier to be quiet. The house grew larger. The rooms more numerous. The distance between them expanded with every square foot. Lillian adapted. She learned to measure her words, to anticipate Josue's moods, to soften herself around the edges so she wouldn't be labeled difficult. When he forgot dates, she reminded herself he was busy. When he canceled plans, she smiled and said she understood. Understanding became her default state. Inside, something else was happening, something slower, quieter. A dimming. She began writing more. Journals filled with thoughts she never said aloud. Questions she didn't dare ask. Hopes she felt foolish for still carrying. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit at the edge of the bed and watch Josue type on his phone, his face lit by the screen, his attention entirely elsewhere. She would wonder how someone could be so physically close and yet unreachable. She stopped asking where he'd been. She stopped asking when he'd be home. Silence became her armor. When she found out she was pregnant, the news landed inside her like a fragile flame. Hope reignited, tentative but persistent. She imagined the baby as a bridge, something that might reconnect what had drifted apart. Josue's reaction had been polite. Measured. "That's good," he'd said, after a pause. "We'll need to plan." Plan. She had smiled, nodding, already adjusting her expectations. Pregnancy changed her body. Her priorities, her sense of time. It made everything feel more urgent. She wanted warmth, stability, presence. She wanted her child to grow up knowing what it felt like to be seen. Josue grew more distant. Doctor appointments came and went. She attended them alone, clutching pamphlets and appointment cards, answering questions about the father with a practiced ease that masked the ache beneath. At night, she felt the baby move and pressed a hand to her stomach, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. "I'll protect you," she murmured in the dark. "I won't let you disappear." She tried again with small gestures, notes on the counter, invitations to join her for dinner, gentle reminders about appointments. Each attempt was met with distracted acknowledgement or delayed responses. Once, she waited up for him, dinner growing cold as the hours passed. When he finally arrived, smelling faintly of something unfamiliar, she didn't accuse him. She simply asked, "Did you have a good night?" He'd frowned, irritated. "Why are you like this?" She hadn't answered. Instead, she cleaned up the dishes and went to bed alone. That was the night she realized something fundamental had shifted. Not in him, but in her. The hurt no longer surprised her. It had become expected. Lillian began to observe rather than react. She watched how Josue moved through the world, how easily he dismissed emotions he couldn't quantify. She noted the way he treated people who offered him nothing tangible with indifference, impatience. She wondered when she had joined that category. The pregnancy sharpened her awareness. She thought often about the kind of mother she wanted to be, the kind of environment she wanted to raise her child in. She pictured her son watching her, learning from the way she allowed herself to be treated. That thought frightened her more than loneliness ever had. Her strength grew quietly, almost imperceptibly. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It settled in her chest like resolve. She stopped sharing her fears with Josue. She started planning. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. She reviewed finances, documents, contacts she'd neglected. She reconnected with parts of herself she'd buried for the sake of peace. Each step felt both terrifying and grounding. Silence, she realized, could be strategic. Josue never noticed the change. He mistook her calm for compliance, her quiet for acceptance. He didn't see the way her eyes had sharpened, the way her movements had grown deliberate. He didn't see the woman standing in front of him. He had stopped seeing her long ago. The night she packed, she moved with steady hands. She folded clothes carefully, choosing only what mattered. She paused once, resting her palm against her stomach, breathing through the weight of what she was about to do. She didn't cry. Tears belonged to earlier versions of herself. When she placed the ring on the table, she did it gently. Not in anger, not in revenge, in closure. Her note was brief because she had said everything already, just not out loud. As she walked out of the penthouse, the door closing softly behind her, Lillian felt something unexpected rise inside her. Relief, not because the future was certain, but because she had finally chosen herself. Back in the empty house, Josue would pace and search and demand answers. But the truth was simple. He had loved the version of Lillian that required nothing. He had never seen the woman she became when she stopped asking to be loved, and that woman was already gone. Josue didn't intend to keep searching. That was the lie he told himself as he moved through the penthouse again. Slower now, more deliberate, he told himself he was looking for answers, for something concrete to explain the impossible absence of a woman he had assumed would always be there. What he was really doing, though he would never admit it, was chasing the illusion of control. If he could find the reason, name it, define it, then maybe he could still manage the outcome. The living room felt colder than it had an hour earlier. The city outside had fully awakened, sunlight slicing through glass and steel, illuminating the space in a way that felt invasive. Josue moved past the couch, past the pristine surfaces that suddenly seemed pointless, and stopped in front of the bookshelf again. Something tugged at his attention. One book sat slightly misaligned, its spine pushed back farther than the others. An art theory, volume dense. Academic. The kind of thing he had once teased Lillian for reading. You and these books, he'd said with a half-smile years ago. Do they ever actually help anyone? She hadn't answered then either. Josue reached for the book now, irritation prickling under his skin. He pulled it free. The cover was heavier than it should have been. He frowned, thumb pressing along the edge, and felt it. A subtle give. A hollow where there shouldn't be one. His pulse spiked. Josue opened the book. Inside, carefully carved into the pages, was a leather-bound journal. For a moment, he simply stared at it. This wasn't careless. This wasn't forgotten. This was hidden. He closed the book slowly and carried the journal to the dining table, setting it down where the ring had been earlier. His fingers hovered over the cover, hesitating for the first time that morning. Reading this felt like crossing a line, but the idea that Lillian had thoughts he didn't know, that she had maintained an entire inner world without him, was unbearable. It felt like betrayal, as if privacy itself were something she had wrongfully claimed. He opened the journal. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Neat, controlled, consistent. The first line stole the breath from his lungs. I don't recognize my husband anymore. Josue's jaw tightened. He read on. The man I married believed in partnership. Somewhere along the way, ambition replaced empathy, and I became a background detail in my own life. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. This wasn't emotional rambling. There were no dramatic flourishes, no exaggerated pain. The words were calm, measured, observational, worse than anger. He flipped the page. He doesn't ask where I've been. He doesn't ask how I feel. I could disappear for hours and he wouldn't notice until it inconvenienced him. Josue exhaled sharply through his nose, irritation flaring. This wasn't fair. He worked. He provided. He carried the weight of an empire so she wouldn't have to worry about trivial things. He turned another page. I'm pregnant, and I've never felt more alone. His chest constricted. I imagine our son watching me one day, learning from the way his father speaks over me, learning that love is something women accommodate rather than receive. Josue slammed the journal shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet penthouse. This is exaggeration, he muttered. She's emotional. The words sounded hollow even to him. He opened the journal again, his movements more aggressive now, flipping pages faster, as if speed could dilute their impact. I think he's lying to me. His stomach dropped. The perfume tonight wasn't mine. The date at the top of the page made his vision blur. Weeks ago. Months. She had known, or at least suspected. Josue felt heat rise up his neck, anger surging to drown out the creeping sense of exposure. He had believed himself careful, discreet. He had told himself that what Lillian didn't know couldn't hurt her. She had been watching, waiting. Another entry caught his eye, circled once in dark ink. Why is Rita calling him this late? Josue's hand tightened until the leather cover creaked. Rita. Seeing the name written in Lillian's careful handwriting did something to him. It stripped away the distance he'd relied on, dragged his double life into the open with brutal efficiency. He read on, dread settling heavily now. I don't confront him anymore. I observe. Patterns tell the truth when people don't. Josue swallowed hard. Patterns. He turned the page. I used to think silence was weakness. I know better now. His breathing grew uneven. The entries shifted subtly after that, not in tone, but in direction. Less questioning. More certainty. The hurt was still there, but it had sharpened into something else. Clarity. I will not raise a son in a home where love feels conditional. Josue pressed his palm flat against the table, grounding himself as the room seemed to tilt. She hadn't been spiraling. She had been deciding. Then he saw the name that made his blood run cold. Lucas Green. The entry was brief, almost cautious. I spoke with Lucas today. Not about Josue. Not directly. About art. About choice. About how people convince you to shrink yourself in the name of loyalty. Josue's vision tunneled. Lucas Green, his rival. The only executive who had ever publicly challenged his ethics. The one man Josue had never been able to intimidate or dismiss. The idea that Lillian had spoken to him, confided in him, sent a surge of hot, acidic rage through Josue's chest. Lucas said something that stayed with me. Some cages are made of gold, but they're still cages. Josue stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's manipulation. He snapped into the empty room. He got to you. The words came easily. Too easily. Blame was a familiar refuge. He paced, dragging a hand through his hair, the journal clenched tightly in his other hand. The thought of Lucas Green positioning himself as a guide, a confidant of Lillian listening to him, was intolerable. Not because Josue loved her the way he should have, but because he couldn't stand the idea of losing something to Lucas. He flipped through more pages, his anger mounting even as the truth cut deeper. I'm no longer angry. I'm tired. Anger wants resolution. Tired wants escape. Josue stopped pacing. The words settled heavily in his chest, dislodging something he'd been avoiding. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't drama. This was exhaustion. He sank into the chair slowly, the journal resting open in front of him. The entries continued, methodical and precise. Lists, plans, dates. She had documented everything. Appointments, financial notes, contacts she trusted, safe places. Timelines. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was strategy. The realization struck harder than any accusation could have. Lillian hadn't been acting from impulse or hysteria. She had assessed, prepared, executed, and she had done it quietly. Josue felt something fracture inside him, an ugly mixture of rage and guilt twisting together. He wanted to tear the journal apart, to erase the evidence of her awareness, her autonomy. Instead, he sat there, staring at the words, forced to confront the version of Lillian he had never truly seen. Intelligent, observant, resilient, not weak, never weak. The anger flared again, sharper now, because beneath it lurked something he refused to name. Regret. He closed the journal slowly, carefully, as if it might explode if handled too roughly. His reflection stared back at him from the glossy surface of the table, controlled, composed, unraveling at the edges. She hadn't left him blindly. She had left him informed. Josue leaned back in the chair, the weight of the morning finally settling into his bones. Whatever came next, whatever moves he planned, whatever battles he intended to fight, one truth was now unavoidable. Lillian hadn't underestimated him. She had understood him, and she had still chosen to walk away. That knowledge lingered in the air long after he stood, journal tucked under his arm, the house silent witness to a reckoning he could no longer outrun. Josue had never liked Lucas Green. That much was easy to admit. Even now, even with everything else collapsing around him. The dislike had nothing to do with personality clashes or boardroom theatrics. It ran deeper than that. Lucas unsettled him in a way few people ever had. They had come up in the same era, two men climbing the same financial ladders, competing for the same contracts, the same investors, the same slices of influence. But where Josue had built his empire through speed, dominance, and relentless pressure, Lucas had taken another path entirely. Measured. Ethical. Slow where Josue was aggressive. That difference had always irritated him. Their rivalry became public years ago, when Lucas challenged one of Josue's acquisitions during a conference panel. Josue remembered it clearly, the low hum of the audience, the polished stage lights, the certainty that no one would dare question him openly. Lucas had done it without raising his voice. Growth without accountability isn't innovation, he'd said calmly. It's risk deferred. Growth without accountability. It's risk deferred. Growth without accountability. The room had gone quiet. Josue had smiled then, sharp and dismissive, countering with numbers, projections, dominance. The audience had applauded both men, but something shifted that day. Lucas Green had marked himself as someone who wouldn't bend, someone who couldn't be bought. Since then, their companies had circled each other cautiously, sometimes competing, sometimes coexisting. Always watching. Lucas never attacked Josue directly again, but he never aligned with him either. He stayed just far enough away to be untouchable. That restraint had always felt like judgment. Now, standing alone in the penthouse, journal still heavy in his hands, Josue understood why the mention of Lucas Green had hit him so hard. Lucas had seen what Josue hadn't. The memory surfaced unbidden an evening Josue had almost forgotten, the charity gala. It had been one of those events Josue attended out of obligation rather than interest. A sprawling venue, understated elegance, donors and executives mingling beneath soft lighting and curated art installations. Lillian had spent weeks preparing for it, choosing a dress that balanced confidence with restraint, rehearsing conversations in her head the way she always did. Josue barely noticed. He had been distracted that night, pulled into conversations about market expansion and political leverage. Lillian moved through the room alone for most of the evening, smiling politely, answering questions about her husband, deflecting attention away from herself. Then Lucas Green had appeared beside her. Josue remembered glancing over and feeling a flicker of irritation. Lucas didn't interrupt, didn't dominate the space. He simply stood there, listening as Lillian spoke with a curator about an installation across the room. Lucas had asked her questions, not polite ones, not performative ones. What drew you to this piece? How do you think context changes interpretation? Lillian had lit up in a way Josue hadn't seen in years. She spoke freely then, her voice steady, animated. She gestured with her hands, forgetting to minimize herself, forgetting to glance around for approval. Lucas listened, truly listened, nodding, asking follow-up questions, engaging her thoughts without redirecting the conversation back to himself. Josue had watched from across the room, annoyance prickling beneath his composure. Later, when Lillian joined him, he'd said lightly, "Lucas Green seems to think very highly of himself." She had hesitated, then replied, "He thinks very highly of ideas." Josue hadn't liked that answer either. The journal made that memory burn sharper now. He flipped to the page again, reading the entry he'd tried to dismiss earlier. "I spoke with Lucas today. Not about Josue. Not directly." Josue scoffed softly. "Of course not," he muttered. But the words that followed had unsettled him for a reason. "He didn't tell me what to do. He asked me what I wanted." Josue closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. Lucas had always operated that way, quietly subversive. He didn't command loyalty. He invited reflection. That difference made him dangerous. The first private conversation between Lucas and Lillian hadn't happened at the gala, though. That had only opened the door. It happened weeks later, over coffee. Lillian had hesitated before agreeing to meet him. She told herself it was professional, that Lucas had reached out about an art initiative tied to his foundation. She told herself it meant nothing, but she had needed that conversation more than she realized. They met in a quiet cafe, far from the polished spaces Josue favored. Lucas arrived on time, dressed simply, his manner calm. He didn't rush, didn't check his phone every few minutes. He greeted her as an equal, not an extension of someone else. They spoke about art first, about creative freedom, about how institutions shape narratives. Then, gradually, the conversation shifted. Lillian didn't plan to say anything personal. It slipped out between sentences, unguarded. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "I feel reduced." Lucas didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He waited. "You're not," he said finally. "You're adapting. That's not the same thing." She looked at him then, startled by the clarity in his voice. "You don't sound surprised," she said. He smiled faintly. "I've seen it before. People convincing themselves they're comfortable when they're actually contained. That was when he said it, the line that would echo in her mind long after she left. "Some cages are made of gold," Lucas said. "But they're still cages." The words landed gently, but they didn't leave. Lillian hadn't responded immediately. She didn't need to. The truth settled in her chest with quiet force. Lucas never pushed further than that. He didn't frame himself as a savior or ally. He didn't ask questions about Josue. He didn't pry. He simply treated her like someone capable of thinking, deciding, choosing. That was enough. Now, back in the penthouse, Josue felt the weight of that difference pressed down on him. Lucas hadn't taken Lillian from him. Josue had left her unprotected. The realization twisted painfully against his ribs, and his anger surged again, not cleanly, not convincingly. It masked something darker beneath it. Guilt. He wanted to believe Lucas had manipulated her, that he had planted ideas, encouraged dissatisfaction, undermined their marriage. That version of events allowed Josue to remain the victim of interference rather than the architect of neglect. But the journal told another story. Lucas hadn't given Lillian a plan. He'd given her language, and she had done the rest herself. Josue paced the room again, running his hand through his hair, irritation flaring each time Lucas's name surfaced in his thoughts. He imagined them speaking, Lillian animated, Lucas attentive, and felt something ugly coil in his chest. Not jealousy. Possession. He hated that Lucas had seen her clearly. Hated that another man had recognized what he'd dismissed. Hated that Lucas's quiet integrity stood in such stark contrast to his own restless ambition. Lucas Green hadn't wanted Lillian. He had respected her. That distinction burned worse than betrayal ever could. Josue stopped pacing and stared out at the city once more. The journal still clutched in his hand. The rivalry he had once framed as professional suddenly felt deeply personal. This wasn't about companies or contracts anymore. This was about power. And for the first time, Josue suspected that Lucas Green had been winning a battle Josue hadn't even known was being fought. Not because Lucas was stronger, but because he had never needed to cage what he claimed to value. As the morning wore on and the city continued its indifferent rhythm below, Josue stood alone with that realization. One that shifted the narrative he'd relied on for years. Lucas Green wasn't his enemy. He was the mirror Josue had spent a lifetime avoiding. And somewhere beyond the glass and steel, Lillian was already building a life where that mirror no longer reflected a man who refused to see her. Lillian did not leave in the middle of the night. She waited for morning, not because she wanted daylight to witness her departure, but because she needed to see clearly to make sure every step was deliberate, every decision intact. Panic belonged to the past. This required steadiness. She woke before dawn, long before the city stirred. The penthouse was quiet, its silence familiar now, almost comforting. She lay still for a moment, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, breathing through the faint anxiety that always surfaced when the baby shifted unexpectedly. "You're okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was reassuring. Carefully, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. Her body felt heavier than it used to, slower, more deliberate. Pregnancy had taught her patience in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every movement now required awareness, respect for limits she could no longer ignore. She moved through the bedroom without turning on the lights, relying on memory. The closet doors were already open. Her bags waited by the wall, packed with intention rather than haste. Lillian had planned this over weeks, not days. She had chosen clothing that felt like herself, not the version she wore to galas, not the carefully curated image that belonged beside Josue. Comfortable dresses, soft sweaters, shoes she could walk in without thinking. She left behind what didn't belong to her anymore. The packing itself had been strangely calm, methodical. Folding each piece of clothing felt like closing a chapter, not tearing it out. She paused once, holding a silk blouse Josue had bought her years ago, then set it back in the drawer. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Her documents were already secured copies stored, originals placed carefully in her bag. Medical records, identification, contact numbers written twice. Just in case, she had triple-checked everything, knowing fear would try to disrupt her focus when the moment came. Fear did arrive. It crept in quietly as she stepped into the hallway, heart fluttering unexpectedly. What if she was wrong? What if she was overreacting? What if she couldn't do this alone? She stopped walking and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The baby moved. A small, insistent reminder of why hesitation was no longer an option. Lillian straightened. She had lived with doubt long enough. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it. She sipped slowly, grounding herself in the sensation. Cool, real, present. Her mind ran through contingencies automatically. If she felt dizzy, she would sit. If the anxiety escalated, she would breathe. If anything felt wrong, she would call for help. She was not reckless. She was prepared. The dining table waited for her next. Lillian stood there for a long moment, staring at the surface where so many quiet meals had passed between them, meals filled with polite conversation and unspoken distance. She reached into her pocket and removed the ring. The diamond caught the low light. Brilliant and impersonal. She turned it once between her fingers, feeling its weight. There had been a time when that ring symbolized everything she wanted: partnership, stability, belonging. Now it felt like an artifact from a life she no longer inhabited. She placed it gently on the table. Not thrown, not discarded, returned. The note came next. She had written it the night before, her handwriting steady, her words chosen carefully. There was no need to explain. Explanation invited debate. Debate suggested uncertainty. She felt none. I hope she was worth what you're about to lose. Lillian folded the paper neatly and placed it beside the ring. The finality of the gesture surprised her not with grief, but with relief. She exhaled slowly, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach again. We're going to be okay, she murmured. Leaving the penthouse was easier than she'd expected. The door closed behind her with a soft click, not the dramatic slam she might have imagined years ago. She didn't look back. Elevators waited. Hallways remained indifferent. In the car waiting downstairs, Lillian settled into the seat carefully, adjusting the belt with practiced ease. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, concern flickering briefly across his face. Are you comfortable, ma'am? He asked. Yes, she said quietly. And for the first time in a long while, the word felt true. As the car pulled away, the tension she'd been carrying for months finally loosened its grip. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't rush. It simply faded, replaced by something gentler. Space. She watched the city pass by through the window, feeling oddly disconnected from the version of herself that had existed behind those walls. The penthouse shrank in the distance, becoming just another building among many. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't check it. That life could wait. The anxiety returned briefly as the car hit traffic, her body responding before her mind could intervene. She pressed her palm to her stomach, counting breaths the way her doctor had taught her. Inhale, exhale. The baby settled again, as if responding to her calm. She smiled faintly. This was the part she hadn't fully anticipated: the emotional release. Not tears, not hysteria, but a quiet, unburdening. A sense of having stepped out of a room where the air had been slowly thinning. Lillian thought about the woman she had been when she first married Josue. Hopeful, accommodating, convinced that love meant endurance. She didn't judge that version of herself harshly. She had done the best she could with what she knew then. But this was different. This was choice. The car crossed into a quieter neighborhood, one she'd selected deliberately. The building wasn't grand. It didn't announce wealth or status. It was modest, safe. Enough. When she stepped inside the apartment that would become her temporary home, Lillian paused just past the doorway. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and sunlight. It was empty except for the essentials she'd arranged ahead of time. No echoes of someone else's expectations. She set her bag down and sat carefully on the edge of the couch, one hand resting against her back as she adjusted. Her body ached slightly now, the delayed response to adrenaline and stress. For a moment, fear tried to resurface. What if something went wrong? What if she needed him? What if she couldn't do this? Then she looked around the room at the quiet, at the simplicity, at the absence of judgment, and felt the answer settle firmly inside her. She already was doing it. Lillian leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the weight of the morning sink in. The baby shifted again, and she laughed softly, surprised by the sound of it. "I know," she whispered. "I know." She wasn't naive. She knew challenges lay ahead, legal complications, emotional fallout, moments of doubt that would test her resolve. But for the first time, those challenges felt like hers to face, not something to endure for someone else's comfort. She stood and moved to the window, sunlight warming her face. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, messy, unpredictable, alive. Lillian rested her hand against the glass and breathed deeply. She had not walked away because she was weak. She had walked away because she was strong enough to stop disappearing. And in choosing herself, she had chosen her child too. For the first time, the future felt like something she could meet without shrinking. She turned away from the window, ready for whatever came next. Rita had learned early that love was an unreliable currency. It fluctuated without warning, demanded loyalty without offering protection, and vanished the moment it became inconvenient. She'd watched it happen in her own family. Watched women bend themselves into shapes that pleased men who never noticed the strain. By the time she was old enough to understand the rules of the world she'd been born into, she had already rewritten them for herself. Love was optional. Security was not. That was how she justified everything that came after. When Rita first met Josue Smith, she didn't see a man. She saw a system, one built on access, influence, and blind spots. He was charming in the way powerful men often were. Practiced, assured, careless with the truth because consequences had never truly found him. He noticed her because she never needed to be noticed. She knew how to be present without demanding space. How to listen without revealing too much. How to let men talk themselves into believing they were understood. Josue mistook that restraint for admiration. She never corrected him. Their relationship, if it could be called that, was defined by convenience. Hotels, late nights, conversations that never ventured anywhere meaningful. Josue spoke often about pressure, about responsibility, about how misunderstood he felt by people who benefited from his success. Rita nodded, asked the right questions, offered the right sympathy. She never asked about his wife. Not because she cared about boundaries, but because curiosity was unnecessary. Rita had already learned what she needed to know. From the beginning, she understood her position clearly. She was not the future. She was the present, useful, temporary, disposable if she overstepped. So she didn't. Instead, she watched. Josue was careless in ways he didn't recognize. He assumed discretion where there was none. He spoke freely around her, his guard lowered by the illusion of intimacy. He took calls in her presence, left documents open, mentioned names and figures without realizing their significance. Rita stored it all away. At first, it was instinctive. Information was safety. Leverage was insurance. She had learned long ago that men like Josue only respected power once it threatened them. As the months passed, her quiet catalog grew. She learned how his company moved money, how certain accounts were structured, how influence flowed behind closed doors. She learned which conversations mattered and which were noise. She didn't set out to destroy him. She set out to protect herself. Copying files became routine. Subtle. Efficient. She never rushed. She never panicked. Each piece of information was taken deliberately, backed up carefully, stored in places Josue would never think to look. He trusted her. That trust was her greatest advantage. Rita never believed Josue loved her. She never wanted him to. Love complicated things. Love asked questions. Love blurred lines she needed sharp and visible. What she wanted was leverage. Status, too, but only as a tool. Being seen with Josue opened doors. Introductions followed. Invitations multiplied. People assumed proximity meant endorsement. She let them assume. When Josue spoke about Lillian rarely, dismissively, Rita listened with detached interest. There was no jealousy. No rivalry. Lillian existed only as a variable in Josue's life, not in Rita's. Still, Rita noticed the shift before Josue did, the tension creeping into his voice. The distraction. The way his attention fractured in subtle ways. He checked his phone more often, scrolled longer, frowned at messages he didn't respond to. Something was changing. Rita adjusted accordingly. She accelerated her timeline not dramatically, not enough to be noticed. She ensured everything she'd gathered was complete, that nothing essential remained unaccounted for. She did not want to be present when the illusion collapsed. The morning Josue woke up to an empty penthouse. Rita was already gone. She had left the city quietly the night before. Her departure as measured as everything else she did. No emotional goodbyes. No explanations. She had closed her accounts, rerouted communications, erased traces with practiced efficiency. Josue tried calling her once, then twice, then more. Rita watched the missed calls appear on her phone without answering. Each vibration confirmed what she had known all along. The moment Josue lost control, she would become a liability. She would not allow that. By the time Josue realized she was unreachable, the files had already begun moving through channels he didn't monitor. Anonymous tips, carefully timed disclosures, subtle enough to avoid detection, precise enough to be impossible to ignore. Josue sat alone in the penthouse, the journal still fresh in his mind, when the first cracks appeared. An email from legal, a request from compliance, an emergency board meeting scheduled without his input. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. The company had weathered storms before. He had always emerged intact. Then the calls kept coming, questions he hadn't anticipated, details he hadn't prepared for, information he knew should not have been accessible. The illusion of control wavered. When he finally accepted that Rita was gone, truly gone, something inside him shifted. He replayed their conversations in his mind, scrutinizing moments he had once dismissed. The ease with which she listened, the way she never reacted emotionally, the way she always seemed to know more than she revealed. A cold understanding settled in his chest. She hadn't loved him. She hadn't even wanted him. She had used him. The realization hit harder than Lillian's departure. Because this wasn't emotional loss. This was exposure. Josue's power had always rested on perception, on the belief that he was untouchable, informed, in control. Rita had dismantled that belief quietly, methodically, without ever raising her voice. The boardroom meeting was brutal. Not explosive, not dramatic, controlled. Questions were framed politely. Concerns raised professionally. But beneath the measured tone was something unmistakable. Distrust. Josue answered as best he could, his confidence slipping with each new detail introduced. Accounts flagged, transactions questioned, decisions he had signed off on scrutinized under a lens he had never faced before. He left the meeting shaken. The city outside no longer felt expansive. It felt watchful. For the first time, Josue began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Lillian hadn't simply left. Rita hadn't simply disappeared. They had both stepped out of a structure that depended on their silence. And without that silence, his world was unraveling. Josue returned to the penthouse and stood in the center of the living room, the space now unbearably still. He replayed Rita's laughter in his mind, the way it had made him feel admired, desired. He saw it clearly now. It had never been affection. It had been patience. The power he had believed he wielded over others was revealed for what it truly was. Conditional. Borrowed. Fragile. Rita had survived because she never confused proximity with protection. Lillian had survived because she refused to disappear any longer. And Josue left behind in the quiet aftermath felt the first true tremor of fear that had nothing to do with loss of love and everything to do with loss of control. The illusion was gone, and with it, the certainty that he had ever been the one in charge. The meeting request arrived without ceremony. No preamble. No context. Just a calendar notification flagged urgent, scheduled for mid-morning, locked so that no one could decline without explanation. Josue stared at the screen longer than necessary, a familiar irritation flaring even as something colder threaded beneath it. Boards didn't call emergency meetings unless control had already shifted. He arrived early, as he always did. The executive floor was quieter than usual, the polished glass walls reflecting a version of himself that felt subtly altered. The confidence was still there, but it felt thinner now, stretched tight over a growing fracture. Board members filtered in one by one, offering nods instead of smiles. Conversations were muted, restrained. No one joked. No one lingered near him the way they once had. That was the first warning. The chairwoman opened the meeting precisely on time. Her voice was calm, measured, professional in a way that signaled distance rather than respect. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she said. "We'll begin." Josue folded his hands on the table, posture relaxed by habit. He had walked into hostile rooms before. This was nothing new. Then the screens lit up. Charts appeared, numbers he recognized, but arranged differently. Highlighted anomalies, patterns isolated and magnified. Accounts he hadn't reviewed in months resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. "We've identified discrepancies." The CFO began carefully, eyes flicking toward Josue and then away again. Several offshore accounts flagged during an internal audit initiated last week. Josue's pulse quickened. He leaned back slightly, expression neutral. "Flagged how?" The response came not from the CFO but from legal. "Inconsistencies between reported allocations and transactional records," she said. "Large enough to warrant concern." Concern. That word landed with weight. Josue straightened. "We've always operated within regulatory frameworks. If there are questions, they can be addressed." The chairwoman nodded once. "They are being addressed." A pause followed. Not an awkward one, a deliberate one. "We've been contacted by federal investigators," she continued. The room went still. Josue felt the air shift. The subtle recalibration of power happening in real time. Federal involvement wasn't procedural. It wasn't routine. It was existential. "What exactly are they alleging?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "At this stage, they're requesting documentation," legal replied. "Full transparency." Josue glanced around the table, searching for allies. He found none. Faces he had known for years now avoided his gaze, their loyalty recalculating itself in the presence of risk. This was the ambush. He saw it clearly now, not emotional, not impulsive, but carefully staged. The audit, the timing, the silence beforehand. Someone had moved first, then a name surfaced. Casually, devastatingly. "Lucas Green's firm has been cooperating fully," the chairwoman added. "They've provided information related to overlapping ventures." Josue's jaw tightened. Of course, Lucas Green always just distant enough to remain untouched, always principled enough to appear clean. Josue had underestimated how dangerous that position could be. He forced a tight smile. "So my competitor is now advising our compliance strategy?" "No." She corrected gently. "They're complying with investigators. As we all must." The distinction mattered. Lucas wasn't attacking. He was stepping aside and letting gravity do the work. The meeting continued. Each agenda item compounding the pressure. Financial forecasts revised downward. Legal exposure outlined in careful language. Risk assessments that once favored aggression now cautioned restraint. Finally, the words Josue had been bracing for arrived. "Effective immediately," the chairwoman said. "The board has voted to place you on temporary suspension pending the outcome of the investigation." Suspension. The room seemed to tilt. Josue opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had argued his way out of worse. He could still fight this, reframe it, delay it, but the decision had already been made. "This is premature," he said finally. "You're reacting to speculation." She met his gaze evenly. "We're reacting to exposure." The difference was lethal. Josue stood slowly, aware of every eye on him, of how the power he once commanded had evaporated in the span of an hour. He nodded once, stiffly, and gathered his things. The walk out of the boardroom felt longer than the meeting itself. Outside, the world was already shifting. His phone buzzed incessantly now, not with personal messages, but with alerts, news outlets, industry publications, whispers turning into headlines with alarming speed. Smith Global faces federal scrutiny. CEO suspended amid financial investigation. The narrative was forming without him. By afternoon, reporters had gathered outside the building. Cameras flashed as Josue exited, his face carefully composed, his silence interpreted as guilt by those eager for spectacle. Questions shouted after him. "Mr. Smith, did you authorize these transactions? Is your company cooperating with federal investigators? Has your wife's departure impacted your leadership?" That one cut deeper than he expected. Josue didn't respond. He slid into the waiting car and closed the door, shutting out the noise but not the reality. The city blurred past the window, familiar landmarks now tinged with menace. For the first time, the scale of what was happening pressed down on him fully. This wasn't just professional fallout. This was collapse. Lucas Green's name appeared again and again, quoted in articles for his firm's commitment to transparency, praised for ethical leadership. The contrast was brutal. Josue stared at the headlines, anger flaring even as something heavier settled beneath it. Lillian had walked away. Rita had vanished. Lucas had waited. And now the world was watching him fall. By evening, the penthouse felt even emptier than before. The silence was no longer just absence, it was accusation. Every polished surface reflected a version of himself he barely recognized. For years, Josue had believed power insulated him from consequence. Now, stripped of title, trust, and narrative control, he understood the truth too late. Power only protected those who knew when to let go, and Josue Smith had never learned how. As night fell and the city lights flickered on, he stood alone at the window, suspended in more ways than one, watching an empire unravel not with a bang, but with signatures, votes, and silence. The ambush was complete, and there was no room left to retreat. Lillian learned about the investigation from a headline she didn't click. The notification flashed briefly on her phone as she stood at the kitchen sink of her small apartment, rinsing a mug she hadn't finished. Smith, Global Faces Federal Scrutiny. The words felt distant, almost unreal, like a story happening in another city, another life. She set the mug down carefully and pressed her palm against her stomach, waiting for the familiar flutter that had begun to steady her whenever anxiety threatened to take over. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." She had known this moment might come. She just hadn't known how it would feel. For weeks after leaving, Lillian had existed in a careful balance relief braided tightly with apprehension. Each day brought a small victory. Waking without dread, breathing without bracing herself, choosing what to do with her time. But beneath those quiet freedoms lay a persistent question she hadn't allowed herself to answer. What would it cost her to tell the truth? The call came 2 days later. The number was unfamiliar, the voice calm and professional. The woman on the line introduced herself as an investigator assigned to the case. She spoke clearly, without pressure, outlining Lillian's rights, her options. "We understand you may have information relevant to our inquiry," she said. "If you're willing, we'd like to speak with you." Lillian thanked her and ended the call without giving an answer. She sat at the table afterward, hands folded, staring at the grain of the wood. The room was quiet in the way she'd grown to appreciate. No tension, no expectation. Still, her chest tightened. She thought of Josue, not with longing, with clarity. She pictured the way he had looked at her during arguments, not angry, not cruel, but dismissive, as if her feelings were inconveniences to be managed rather than signals to be heard. She remembered how easily he'd spoken over her, how confidently he'd assumed her silence meant consent. If she testified, she would be stepping back into his world, and Josue did not lose gracefully. Fear crept in, then not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady and insistent. Fear of retaliation, fear of legal entanglements, fear of becoming collateral damage in a war she hadn't chosen to fight. Her hand drifted to her stomach again. She thought of her son, of the future he would inherit. Lillian stood and moved to the window, watching pedestrians pass below. Ordinary people, living ordinary lives, making choices without the weight of billion-dollar empires pressing against their spines. She had wanted that once. Now she understood something deeper. Silence had protected Josue for years. It would not protect her child. The decision didn't come with a dramatic surge of courage. It arrived quietly, settling into place like a truth she had been circling for months. She would testify, not out of vengeance, not out of obligation, out of responsibility. The preparation was meticulous. Lillian reviewed documents. She had kept copies of financial summaries Josue had once dismissed as irrelevant, emails she had archived instinctively, notes from conversations she'd recorded privately in her journals. She hadn't gathered them with this moment in mind. She had gathered them because she had learned to trust patterns over promises. Each piece of evidence told a story not of overt criminality, but of systems designed to obscure accountability, of decisions made behind closed doors, of power insulated by silence. The day she arrived at the federal building, Lillian wore a simple dress and flat shoes. She moved slowly, carefully, conscious of her body's limits. The security guard offered a chair when he noticed her pregnancy. "Thank you," she said, surprised by the kindness. Inside the interview room, the atmosphere was neutral. No intimidation, no judgment, just questions. She answered them calmly, her voice steady even when her hands trembled slightly. She spoke about timelines, about conversations, about moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now carried weight. She did not embellish. She did not editorialize. She told the truth as she understood it. When they asked about Rita, Lillian paused. "I didn't know her," she said honestly. "But I knew something was wrong." She described the late-night calls, the unfamiliar perfume, the way Josue's attention fractured. She spoke of her growing awareness not as an accusation, but as an observation. The investigators listened. They took notes. They asked follow-up questions that confirmed what Lillian had suspected all along. She hadn't imagined it. When the interview ended, she felt drained but lighter, as if a weight she'd carried unconsciously had finally been set down. Outside, the air felt sharper, clearer. Across the city, Josue was unraveling. He watched the news obsessively now, scrolling through updates he couldn't control, reading analyses written by people who had never met him but were eager to define him. His suspension had become a spectacle. His name, once synonymous with innovation, now trailed words like scrutiny and exposure. The more he tried to intervene, the less effective he became. Lawyers spoke in cautious tones. Advisors hedged their recommendations. People who once answered his calls immediately, now delayed or redirected. And then he learned Lillian had testified. The information came secondhand, murmured through legal channels, confirmed by a clipped email. He stared at the screen, disbelief giving way to something raw and jagged. "She wouldn't," he said aloud, pacing the penthouse. "She wouldn't do this." But she had. The realization struck deeper than any headline. Lillian quiet, accommodating Lillian had stepped into the light he'd always assumed she feared. His anger flared, sharp and immediate. But it faltered just as quickly, because beneath it lay an uncomfortable truth he could no longer deny. She hadn't betrayed him. She had stopped protecting him. Josue replayed their marriage in fragments now, searching for moments he could reinterpret, opportunities he might have salvaged. Each memory sharpened his sense of loss, not of love, but of control. He had believed he was the architect of their lives. He had been wrong. Back in her apartment, Lillian lay on the couch that evening, exhaustion settling into her bones. The baby kicked softly, a reminder of the life growing steadily within her, indifferent to corporate collapses and public reckonings. She smiled faintly. "I did the right thing," she whispered, not as a question, but as a promise. For the first time, the fear receded entirely, not because the future was safe, but because it was honest. Lillian had stepped forward not as a victim, not as an accessory to someone else's story, but as a witness to her own experience. Her strength hadn't come from confrontation or aggression. It had come from clarity, and as Josue's world continued to fracture under the weight of scrutiny, Lillian's began, quietly and steadily, to rebuild itself around truth. The balance of power had shifted, not through force, but through a woman who refused to remain silent any longer. The pain did not arrive all at once. It began as a tightening low and insistent wrapping around Lillian's abdomen like a warning she didn't want to acknowledge. She stood still in the kitchen, one hand braced against the counter, breathing carefully as she had been taught. Not yet, she told herself. It's too soon. She had been tired all day. A deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that sleep hadn't touched. Testifying had taken more out of her than she'd expected. Not emotionally, she felt steady there, but physically, the strain of holding herself together through hours of careful recollection, of answering questions without faltering. Another tightening followed, sharper this time. Lillian closed her eyes. "Okay," she whispered, calm even as her heart began to race. "Okay." She checked the clock. Not panic. Information first. She had learned that lesson well. When the pain came again, closer together now, she didn't hesitate. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone. Lucas answered on the second ring. "Lillian, I think something's wrong," she said quietly. "I'm having contractions." There was no hesitation in his response. No questions that didn't matter. "I'm on my way," Lucas said. "Unlock the door and sit down if you can. Don't move more than you have to." She did exactly that. By the time Lucas arrived, the pain had intensified, no longer just pressure, but a deep, pulling sensation that stole her breath. He found her seated on the couch, shoulders tense, one hand pressed firmly against her stomach. "I'm here," he said gently. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "I didn't think it would happen like this." "Let's not decide what this is yet," he replied calmly. "We'll let the doctors do that." The drive to the hospital blurred into flashes of sound and light. Sirens. Traffic. Lucas's voice steady beside her, reminding her to breathe, to focus. Her fear rose and fell with each contraction. Sharp spikes of panic threatening to undo the calm she'd fought so hard to maintain. At the emergency entrance, everything moved quickly. Hands guided her onto a gurney. Questions layered over one another. Dates, weeks, symptoms. Lucas answered when she couldn't, his voice firm but measured. Inside, the room was bright and cold. Machines beeped softly as nurses moved with practiced urgency. A monitor was strapped around her abdomen, its steady rhythm both comforting and terrifying. The doctor's face was serious but controlled. "You're having preterm contractions," she said. "We're going to do everything we can to slow them." Lillian nodded, tears pricking unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, not from pain, but from fear she could no longer ignore. "I've been careful," she whispered. "I did everything right." The doctor met her gaze. "Stress can be a powerful trigger. This isn't your fault." The words loosened something in her chest. Lucas stood just outside her line of sight, close enough that she could feel his presence without needing to look. He didn't intrude, didn't overwhelm. He simply stayed. Hours passed in fragments. Medication. Monitoring. Instructions spoken gently but firmly. Lillian drifted between focus and exhaustion, her body working through something she couldn't control. And then movement at the door. Josue. He looked nothing like the man who had once commanded rooms without raising his voice. His suit was rumpled, his tie gone, his hair disheveled. Panic sat openly on his face. Unmasked and uncontained. "Lillian," he said, stepping forward. "I came as soon as I heard." Her eyes met his briefly. There was no relief there, no comfort, only distance. "What's happening?" he asked, voice cracking. "Is the baby okay?" Before she could answer, the nurse intervened gently but firmly. "Sir, please stay back." Josue froze, unused to being stopped. Lucas stepped slightly into view, then not defensively, not possessively, simply present. "I'll update you when there's something to share," he said quietly. The power dynamic shifted in that moment with devastating clarity. Josue wasn't the authority here. He wasn't the decision-maker. He was excess. Lillian watched the realization settle across his face, watched his anger flicker and die beneath something far more vulnerable. "Fear. I never wanted this," Josue said hoarsely. "I never wanted to hurt you." She closed her eyes briefly, another contraction rippling through her body. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it worse." The words landed softly, but they struck with precision. Josue stepped closer, lowering his voice as if volume alone might make him heard. "Please," he said. "Let me stay. Let me help." Lillian looked at him fully then, really looked at him, and saw what she had been too afraid to name before. He wasn't asking out of love. He was asking out of fear of losing. "No," she said simply. The nurse guided him back, her expression kind but unyielding. "We need space." Josue didn't argue. He stood there, hands hanging uselessly at his sides, as the room reorganized itself around Lillian, around the life she was fighting to protect. Lucas remained, not because he insisted, because Lillian had not asked him to leave. As the medication began to work, the contractions slowed. The urgency softened into vigilance. The doctor returned with cautious optimism. "We've managed to stabilize things for now," she said. "But you'll need to stay overnight for observation." Relief washed through Lillian in a trembling wave. She nodded, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Tears slipped free, then not from fear this time, but from release. Lucas moved closer, offering a glass of water, his presence grounding without demanding acknowledgement. "You did exactly what you needed to," he said quietly. She believed him. Across the hall, Josue sat alone, his head in his hands. The hospital hum pressed in around him, indifferent and unyielding. He replayed the moment again and again the way Lillian had looked at him. Not with hatred, not even anger, but with calm resolve. He had never seen her like that, and it terrified him. By morning, Lillian slept fitfully, her body still tense but no longer in crisis. The baby's heartbeat echoed steadily through the room, a rhythm that anchored her back to herself. She woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds and Lucas seated quietly nearby, reading something on his phone. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," she admitted. "But, okay." He nodded. "That's enough for today." She smiled faintly. Outside, the world continued to spin, media speculation intensifying, Josue's empire unraveling further, narratives forming without his input. Inside the hospital room, something far more important had shifted. Lillian had faced fear head-on. She had protected herself. She had protected her child. And for the first time, the power Josue once wielded so effortlessly meant nothing at all. The climax had begun not with shouting or confrontation, but with a woman choosing calm over chaos, strength over submission, and life over illusion. The rest would follow. The hospital room was quiet in a way that felt earned. Not the tense quiet of waiting rooms or the brittle silence of fear, but the steady, breathing calm that followed survival. Morning light filtered through the blinds, soft and pale, settling gently over Lillian's face. Machines hummed in low, reassuring rhythms. The baby's heartbeat strong, insistent rose and fell like a promise. Lillian lay propped against pillows, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. Her body was exhausted, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years. There was no confusion left inside her, no second guessing. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something solid had taken root. A knock came at the door. She knew who it would be before it opened. Josue stepped inside slowly, as though entering unfamiliar territory. He looked smaller here, diminished by fluorescent lights and institutional walls that did not respond to wealth or reputation. His eyes were rimmed red. His hands trembled when he clasped them together, as if he were afraid they might betray him. "Can I sit?" he asked. Lillian studied him for a long moment before nodding once. He took the chair nearest the bed, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend distance. The space between them felt deliberate, measured in truth rather than habit. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm stable," she replied. "The baby is stable." Relief flickered across his face, raw and unguarded. He exhaled sharply, as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "Thank God." She didn't respond. The silence stretched. This one was different from all the others they had shared. It wasn't avoidance. It wasn't resignation. It was invitation. Josue swallowed hard. "I've been trying to find the right words," he began. "I don't know if there are any." Lillian remained still, attentive but unmoved. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. "For everything. For the way I treated you. For not being there. For making you feel—" He faltered, searching. "Invisible." The word hung between them, heavy and exposed. She nodded slowly. "You did make me invisible." His shoulders sagged, as if the confirmation struck harder than accusation. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quickly. I thought I was providing. I thought that was enough." "That's what you told yourself," Lillian replied gently. "But you never asked what I needed." He leaned forward, desperation creeping into his posture. "I can change. I am changing. Everything that's happening, losing the company, the investigation, It's all forcing me to see things differently. I see you now." She met his gaze then, steady and unflinching. "No," she said. "You see yourself losing." The truth landed without cruelty, but it landed all the same. Josue recoiled slightly, as if struck. "That's not fair." "It is," she said quietly. "If nothing had fallen apart, you wouldn't be sitting here. You wouldn't be apologizing. You wouldn't even notice that I almost lost our child." His mouth opened, then closed again. He had no rebuttal for that. "I waited," Lillian continued. "For years. I waited for you to come home earlier, to ask how I was doing and listen to the answer, to touch my hand without distraction, to look at me like I mattered." Her voice didn't waver. That was what stunned him most. "I told myself I was being patient. That love meant endurance. That if I just stayed quiet, stayed supportive, stayed grateful, you would come back to me eventually." Tears welled in Josue's eyes. "I did love you." She shook her head slowly. "No, you loved what I represented. Stability, image, control. You loved how I fit into your life." The distinction cut deeper than accusation ever could. "I loved you," she went on. "I loved you enough to disappear for you. I shrank my world so yours could stay large. I stopped speaking when it felt unsafe to be honest. I learned how to make myself small without even realizing it." Her hand tightened briefly over her stomach, grounding herself. "But that wasn't love," she said. "That was survival." Josue stared at her, something inside him fracturing completely. "Then, what am I supposed to do now?" She considered the question carefully, then answered with quiet certainty. "Let go." The words seemed to empty the room of air. "I'm not asking you to be punished," she added. "I'm not asking you to suffer. I'm asking you to stop reaching for what you already lost." He shook his head, anguish etched into every line of his face. "I can't just walk away." "You already did," she said softly. "A long time ago." The realization broke through his defenses then. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking as the weight of it all finally crushed him. "I ruined everything," he whispered. Lillian watched him not with satisfaction, not with pity, but with clarity. "No," she said. "You revealed everything." He looked up at her, eyes wet and hollow. "I spent years thinking you were fragile," he said hoarsely. "That you needed me." She almost smiled. "You didn't break me," she said. "You woke me up." The words settled like a final verdict. A knock came at the door again, this time firmer. 2 security officers stood just outside, respectful, but resolute. "Mr. Smith," one of them said gently, "we need to escort you out." Josue froze, humiliation flooding his expression. He looked at Lillian one last time, searching for something: permission, forgiveness, hope. She offered none of those. Only peace. "Take care of yourself," she said. "For our child's sake, if nothing else." He nodded numbly and stood, his movements slow and heavy. As security guided him toward the door, he paused. "I really am sorry," he said. "I know," she replied, "and that's enough." The door closed behind him with a soft click. The silence that followed was profound. Lillian exhaled. A long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from grief, but from release. From the unburdening of truth finally spoken aloud. Lucas stepped closer, careful not to intrude. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, wiping her face. "I am now." Outside the room, Josue was escorted down the hallway, past curious glances and whispered recognition. The man who once commanded every space he entered now moved through it unnoticed, stripped of authority, stripped of illusion. Inside, Lillian rested her hand over her belly again, feeling the steady reassurance of life continuing. The confrontation was over, not with shouting, not with revenge, but with truth. And truth, she had learned, was the most powerful ending of all. Weeks later, the city greeted Lillian differently. Not with the blinding glare of spotlights or the sharp angles of glass towers, but with morning light that slipped gently between buildings, warming sidewalks and softening edges. The apartment she had chosen sat on a quiet street where the noise arrived muted, filtered through trees and distance. It wasn't large. It wasn't impressive by anyone else's standards. It was hers. Sunrise found her awake most mornings now. Not from anxiety, not from habit, but from a steady rhythm she had begun to trust her body, her breath, the small movements of life growing inside her. She stood by the window with a mug of tea cradled between her hands, watching the sky change colors like a promise slowly being kept. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus and clean linen. There were boxes still unpacked, books stacked in corners, art leaning against walls waiting to be hung. Nothing here felt staged. Nothing was curated for approval. That was the point. She had learned to love the quiet. Not the silence that once pressed in on her like punishment, but the kind that arrived without demand. The kind that allowed thoughts to settle rather than scatter. Lillian moved slowly now, deliberately. She had learned the value of listening to her body, to the child she carried, to the small internal compass she had ignored for too long. The doctor's instructions were taped neatly to the refrigerator. Appointments circled on a calendar she checked without dread. Motherhood no longer felt like something happening to her. It felt like something she was choosing. She ran her hand along the edge of the crib she had assembled herself, fingers tracing the smooth wood. It stood in the corner of her bedroom, unfinished by design. She wanted the space to evolve, to grow alongside the child who would soon fill it with sound and movement. Preparation, she had learned, didn't require perfection, only intention. Some days, memories surfaced without warning, echoes of a life she had lived in parallel, where rooms were larger and expectations louder, where her reflection had been measured against optics rather than truth. When those moments arrived, she didn't fight them. She let them pass. Healing, she discovered, wasn't erasure. It was integration. It was allowing the past to exist without letting it dictate the present. She returned to her work quietly, not with announcements or press releases, but with emails sent and meetings taken on her own terms. The art world welcomed her back without spectacle curators and directors who remembered her mind before they remembered her marriage. Ideas flowed easily now, unburdened by the need to ask permission. Lucas checked in occasionally, never hovering, never assuming. Their conversations were grounded, respectful, focused on what was ahead rather than what had been lost. He admired her strength without trying to define it. That too mattered. One afternoon, Lillian stood at the window again, sunlight spilling across the floor, and realized she felt light, not happy in the loud, performative way she once thought happiness looked, but steady, whole, unafraid of the future. She placed a hand over her stomach as the baby shifted, a small reminder of the life unfolding within her. "I've got you," she whispered, "and I've got me." Across the city, narratives continued to unravel and reform. Headlines shifted. Empires restructured. Josue's name appeared less frequently now, replaced by new stories hungry for attention. Lillian did not follow them. Her freedom wasn't defined by his downfall. It was defined by her return. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that softened as the day unfolded, Lillian opened the windows and let fresh air fill the room. She breathed deeply, savoring the simple luxury of space, physical and emotional. Walking away, she had learned, was not surrender. It was strategy. It was courage. It was the decision to stop waiting for permission to live. And in that choice, she found something far more valuable than anything she had left behind. She found herself. If this story moved you, if Lillian's journey reminded you of your own strength or the power of choosing yourself like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? Your support helps us keep sharing stories of resilience, truth, and freedom, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and begin again.